Welcome. In this video on World War II, we will conclude the war with a look at the campaign of 1945 and explore a couple of themes going into the post-World War II world. One of the early events in 1945 is the meeting at Yalta, where the Big Three, Prime Minister Winston Churchill, U.S. President Franklin Roosevelt, and Soviet Premier Joseph Stalin all meet in the southern Soviet Union, and they all agree that there will be no separate peace. They will demand unconditional surrender of the Axis powers. They also, in a way, tacitly or quietly agree that the Soviet Union will have influence over Eastern Europe that will later be interpreted as domination. An outcome of this is that for the next 40 plus years, Eastern Europe will be under the jackboot, under the rule, under the domination and influence of the Soviet Union until its fall in 1990. Also, Russia finally agrees to attack Japan, who the two of them have not even declared war on each other, and there's been no fighting in East Asia between Russia and Japan yet. What happens in 1945? On the Western Front, the Italian campaign continues, and it's a struggle to the end. The terrain and the peninsular nature of Italy prevents major breakthrough, but the Americans and British continue to push the German forces northward up the Italian peninsula. And an interesting event is Mussolini's dramatic rescue, but his terrible fate. German hang gliders rescued Mussolini from house arrest and brought him back to a degree of power. But his terrible fate is his own people at one point turned on him. He was walking streets of Italy and was accosted by his own people, and he and his mistress or wife were shot and then strung up by their heels to a lamppost and then urinated on by men and women, the reports say, and then they were attached to the bumper of a car and had their bodies dragged around town and totally desecrated. This is one of the reasons when people say, why did Hitler kill himself and have the SS burn his body? This is why. You know, he didn't want a place where people could dance on or pee on his grave. He didn't want his body dragged through the streets or peed on or worse. And so he will learn from what happens to Mussolini in order to orchestrate his own death later. And then the Allies will drive into Germany. But before they do, Hitler had one more Christmas surprise, where on Christmas Day of 1944, he attempts the last Nazi reserves to push through the Allied lines once again and drive to basically separate the British and American forces, maybe force the British to evacuate at another Dunkirk, and drive a wedge. The weather changed, though, and when the weather got clear, the Allied air superiority could kick in, and also Patton's Third Army in France was able to drive northward and drive a wedge into the German wedge and defeat this last Axis attack on the Western Front, using up the last Nazi reserves in January of 1945. The Allies then push across the Rhine River, and with the last Nazi reserves, they are utterly overwhelmed. There is good campaigning weather. The Allies had built up major reserves all winter, and they race the Russians to Berlin. The Russians engage in a street-by-street fight against the Nazis, who have started a scorched earth policy of their own, and Hitler, in his last days, is ordering everything that they have to be destroyed and burned, and that the German people were not up to his greatness and his challenge. That is only partially, really, barely fulfilled. But as the Russians are closing in on Hitler's bunker, he and his mistress, who becomes his wife in their last days, he shoots himself, and she kills herself, and has the SS burn their bodies and scatter their ashes in the ruined city of Berlin, again, so that no desecration of their bodies or desecration of their gravesite could ever happen, because there is no such body. There is no such marker. They've been destroyed. Any conspiracy theories about Hitler surviving and whatever have largely been debunked and are especially moot now because, 75 years ago, Hitler was 55 years old. So those, there used to be these sayings that Hitler had been alive and spotted somewhere else. That's all sort of conspiracy rumor. But we have it under pretty clear authority what really happened to Hitler. And then on May 8th, 1945 is VE, or Victory in Europe Day, as the Russian and American troops met at the Elbe River and basically smashed all of Germany between them, ending the German war effort. But in the Pacific, Japan was not yet defeated, and you had a couple of significant battles. One was the island of Iwo Jima, which was taken between February and March of 1945, almost a month of fighting, and the U.S. casualties actually exceeded the Japanese. So, remember, casualties are killed and wounded. 26,000 U.S. servicemen were killed or wounded, with 26,000 killed, but of the 18,000 Japanese casualties, all 18,000 were killed. The Japanese largely do not surrender. Many of them will commit seppuku, harikiri, ritual suicide. They'll plunge a knife into their abdomen and try to pull it over to their side, spilling their guts literally in a very gruesome form of death, of a suicide, and that this is what soldiers will do. This is also the famous placing of the Mount Suribachi flag, where the fighting was going on, and famously the 5 soldiers mount a large flag to indicate to all the troops below that the top had been reached and the battle was almost over. And this is just a very famous moment in American military history. And then next to last, the battle on Okinawa, lasting over 2 months, where you had 62,000 U.S. casualties, but all of the Japanese casualties are indeed killed. Again, as those they simply attack until they die, or they'll even kill themselves rather than surrender. The most shocking aspect of Okinawa, where for the first time many of the people there are ethnically very similar to the Japanese, a third of the civilians killed themselves. 100,000 out of 300,000 residents on Okinawa killed themselves. There was a particular cliff where hundreds, maybe thousands of people ran to the top of this cliff and threw themselves off rather than fall into the hands of the evil Americans. A lot of the Japanese propaganda had said that the Americans would mutilate them and torture them and eat their babies and do all kinds of mean, ugly, nasty things. And so Japanese civilians killed themselves in large number rather than allow themselves to be taken by the American army. This is part of the motive to use the atomic bomb. Not only, although the main priority is to save the lives of American soldiers, but there is also this idea that the Japanese will not surrender, and that even civilians will kill themselves in large number rather than surrender, is an additional motivator to use nuclear weapons, the atomic bomb, to end the war. Even at this late date, you had the Japanese refusal to surrender, the evidence by the Banzai attacks, attack until you die, the harikiri or seppuku, the ritual suicide of the Japanese soldiers rather than surrender. You had the kamikaze attacks where the airplanes are turned into missiles and crashed into ships rather than admit defeat. You have the civilians in Okinawa who will throw themselves off of a cliff rather than surrender. And an interesting point is that the Japanese had standing orders that the minute their homeland, the main islands of Japan, were invaded, that every Allied POW, many of whom were taken from the Philippines and had actually survived the Bataan Death March, would immediately be executed rather than allow them back into the hands of the Americans. They would execute illegally all the POWs they had the minute that the Japanese home islands were attacked by the American troops. In this context, you had the so-called Manhattan Project, the development of the atomic bomb. And the scientists developing it did not know all of the outcomes. There were those who said the first time they dropped the very first bomb test in New Mexico, they said, well, hey, this might set the atmosphere on fire. This might end the world. Probably not. There's a chance this could start a chain reaction that would just end the world. Probably not. Let's see what happens. they chose two cities that they had specifically not been attacking with other bombing attacks. Remember that Allied strategic bombing? They did a lot of this in Europe, but also against Japan. People who lived in both Hiroshima and Nagasaki believed themselves lucky because their towns were never hit by American bombers. The reason for this was that the Americans wanted to use the atomic bombs not only as a show of force to win the war and force the Japanese to surrender, not only to save American lives, not only maybe even to save Japanese lives from mass suicide, not only to intimidate Stalin and the Soviet Union, but they also were trying to figure out what atomic bombs would do. They were really curious what an atomic bomb would do to a city that was untouched, because if they were bombing it with traditional bombs and then dropped an atomic bomb on it afterwards, there would be no way of knowing what damaged what. But if they dropped it on a virgin untouched city, they would be able to say, this city was perfectly intact, and then we dropped an atomic bomb on it, so all of the damage we know is what an atomic bomb would do. So they announce that they have a terrible weapon, they'll do something. They drop the bomb on August 6th, destroying the city of Hiroshima. They say that they have more to come. There's no surrender. They drop another one on Nagasaki, and the United States implies that we have many more. We actually did not. It would actually take, I believe, several weeks or months before they could even have another bomb to drop, but they imply that the United States has many more. The Soviet Union, after the bomb is dropped, then invades Manchuria at that late date. But within a week, on VJ, or Victory over Japan Day, Japan surrenders. And they actually get one condition. Even though they demanded unconditional surrender, the one condition they are granted is that the emperor will not be tried, executed, and will be permitted to remain in power. Remember, the emperor's culpability for the war is pretty murky. The blame was placed on Yamamoto and Tojo and other military leaders who they would be held accountable, but that the emperor would be allowed to remain in power. And so this concludes World War II and brings us to the Cold War, which you'll study next year in Modern Global Issues, or senior year in IB History. A couple of the starting points coming into the Cold War that leads us into modern world history are the Nuremberg trials. Many of there's a tribunal set up after the war to try to hold war criminals accountable. It creates the idea that just following orders isn't good enough. After World War I, there really weren't trials. Even though they blamed Germany, they just blamed the whole country. After World War II, they held a trial at Nuremberg, and they imprisoned and even hanged or gave the death penalty to a good number of Nazis who were commanders who claimed they were just following orders, but were held responsible even with their imprisonment or even with their lives by the end of the war. A big legacy is the Marshall Plan. The United States invests millions, billions of dollars rebuilding the entire world. The United States, in many ways, was the only country left standing and left untouched, and had enormous economic and industrial dominance of the world, and the United States willingly rebuilt the economies of almost every other part of the world that had been destroyed. It sets that precedent that we see in more recent years. The United States, say, attacks Iraq and then rebuilds Iraq after the war. That is a major theme in history going out of it. Perhaps one of the most impactful things coming out of the war is the development of nuclear weapons, the atomic bomb, and the role that that will play. It was said that I don't know exactly what weapons World War III will be fought with, but I do know that World War IV will be fought with sticks and stones. Meaning that a true total war like World War II, if it included atomic weapons, would effectively end the world and pound the world back to the Stone Age and destroy all the major cities and population of the world, which is a game changer. Another legacy is that of the United Nations, an attempt at world peace, world government, a way to prevent such a future war that would hopefully be stronger than the failed League of Nations. And finally, the Cold War, the unfought tension or hostility between the United States and the Soviet Union that would last in a major way and dominate the next 40 years of world history. Thanks for watching.